Hello, everybody. Your friendly death investigator here, and we're back. Another autopsy discussion episode. We got a few things to go over this week. It's kind of all over the place, so I'll try to keep it together as well as I can. But just randomly, if you're depending on when you listen to this, this is April. This is the middle of April now, and we just did the Truett McKeon case, and that was a case that I alluded to it on. I think I alluded to it on a previous discussion. I can't remember, but I know that I mentioned it on. If you follow, like again, if you feel the need to follow me on anywhere on social media, we're kind of everywhere, but I'm most active on Twitter. Some Instagram, some Facebook, but overall, Twitter is kind of the place to follow me. And I had been alluding to, I didn't name Truett. I didn't really mention what the case was before it was released. I just mentioned that it was a different sort of case than what we'd done previously. And I wasn't, again, the response to it was really good, but I don't think I'll ever get truly comfortable with not having anxiety about some of the cases that I choose. There is a case that's upcoming that I've sort of already decided to be the 10th episode. And it's one of the cases that it's a case I've been wanting to do for a while, but I've held off doing it. It's a case I've been wanting to do actually since before I ever did the first episode of this show. But I've held off doing it for a variety of reasons. Hopefully it'll probably make sense when it comes around, but it, as much as getting to Truett's case and doing sort of a drug overdose for an autopsy episode made me sort of a bit hesitant because, typically what we do here is very, I always say we're kind of true crime adjacent, or we're an addendum kind of true crime show. But I guess that's not entirely accurate. We certainly do. The majority of the stuff we do is true crime related. And if I had to pick a genre, I would, if I was, gun to my head, if it was like, okay, what kind of show is this? I would say, well, I guess it's more educational than anything, but it does lend itself to true crime. But not always. And Truett's case was kind of the first one that, you could make the argument that Elisa Lamb's case, that wasn't a homicide, but her case was so surrounded with, if you go back and listen, and I try to address as much of it as I can without being too curt about some stuff, but you could argue that, that case isn't technically true crime, but it does draw it draws that crowd. So there was nothing whenever I picked it. I was like, oh, this is, this isn't the case had so much interest on it from the moment it came into the public eye all those years ago now. And I just thought I had, I would say I thought I had a unique perspective, but it was also if it's one thing I've been critical of the documentary for Lamb, I sort of went over like a compare and contrast the Lamb doc versus the Watts case docs over on Patreon, if you want to listen to that. So I won't go into too much in the detail of that. Suffice to say that when you get to the end of the Lamb doc, it all kind of boils down to the medical examiner saying, yeah, we checked everything. We looked at this. I was aware of this, that sort of thing. And it's an accident. So I don't pretend to think that or believe that I ever had like a truly unique perspective, but I did have a perspective that a lot of people just either didn't want to hear or didn't take the time to look into. And yeah, that was Lamb's case. She was, that was an accident, but had all this sort of just a little bit of insanity around it in a way that Truett's case didn't. Some people, I actually had a friend, she knew about Truett's case. I'd never heard of him. I think I'd heard of, I was vaguely familiar with his father, Toby Mac. I'd heard his name before, and I could not have told you that he was like a Christian hip hop artist. I really had nothing or knew nothing about him. He was in a band, and I think this was a 90s band. I do very little research on that kind of stuff, but it was I remember the band DC Talk. I do remember that. And that being like a Christian band. I couldn't even tell you what kind of genre it was. It was just DC Talk. They're a Christian band. Not really my thing, but had heard of Toby Mac. And even though I'd heard the name, I could not have told you that he was in DC Talk. So yeah, and certainly didn't know he had a son, and certainly didn't know, the sort of the tragedy that kind of befell Truett. But a friend, I guess, knew about it, and she was talking to me about it. And it was just one of those things where I had always intended to do a drug overdose case, and probably will do more. But that, one of the things about this show was always, we would do true crime stuff, and we would also tackle cases that weren't so well known, whether they're homicides or not. And his sort of fit that case where not a lot of people knew about it, but it was it in the realm of drug overdose cases. You could say his was probably very popular in that very, very small sub-genre, whatever you want to call it. Most drug overdose cases you never hear about. And it's sort of the tragedy of drug overdose cases, because they are kind of the bread and butter of a lot of medical examiners' offices. There's just so many of them. So I was, and I'll get into it more in a little bit. I was just kind of hesitant about doing a case that wasn't technically true crime, but there was something to be said about it, and there'll be more to be said about it in the future. So yeah, little anxiety about it, but again, it was well received. I got just random messages about that one, and it. I don't have to tell you, if you guys have been listening and paying or listening to any of these discussion episodes so far, I'm exceedingly appreciative of any and all feedback, which is a great way to segue into, hey, please leave us a review or a rating, whatever you have time for. That's something I usually try and plug each discussion episode. I won't dwell on it too much here, but rating only takes, a second to do. A review, it doesn't have to be long. Just if you like the show in any kind of way, just let us know. And again, it spreads us to more viewers. It makes us easier to find because of these wonky algorithms that I truly don't understand. I don't. I just know that when we get reviews, I'm like, oh, suddenly we've got a little bump in views. It does work, I suppose. But yeah, that episode was well received. The episode, it's not going to be next month's episode. It'll be the 10th episode that, like, as much as I'd say I get anxiety about a lot of cases, this is the one that, I don't know. If I get negative feedback about any case, it'll probably be that one. And I won't give anything away. I'm still working on it. But that'll be the 10th episode. But I won't dwell too much on that. But again, just everyone that's been listening so far and been sending feedback, thank you. So another thing before we get into it, though actually two things, but the first one, so I think it was last discussion, I talked about a project that I'd been working on, kind of a collaboration between me, and I didn't mention who it was then, but I'll go ahead and shout him out now. It's the podcast is called Darwin's Deviations, and he does these very, very insane. It's kind of a performance art piece. It's very much, I think I described it as kind of Mystery Science Theater meets South Park by way of Deadpool. It's very explicit. It's very gonzo is the best way to describe it. He kind of takes crazy science things that very niche, maybe like stuff that most people haven't heard of. They're just like insane things that are real that he finds fascinating, and he makes these crazy fictional like adventure episode type things, and it's very out there. It's very not true crime. But he was just a person that when I first started getting into doing the show, he kind of reached out and we kind of became friends. And he was working on this episode, or he had sort of pitched an idea, and I guess I can go into it. It's not really a spoiler now. The episode, if you want to go listen to it, I think it's episode 19, called like Vampire Watermelons, and I can't remember the full title, but episode 19, Vampire Watermelons, Darwin's Deviations. It's wherever you can, wherever you get your podcast, you can look it up. But 3, 2, 1, spoilers. So we were joking. I forget what, like, he does a fair amount of collaborations, or he's been doing more and more, I should say. And I don't remember. I remember initially when we were joking about just stuff that would be funny or would be funny on his show. He was like, "Would you want to?" Because the idea was if I ever did anything for his show, it would be something like completely insane, and that was something that like I'll absolutely do collaborations for people of like interviews or discussions with other podcasts. That's fine, but there was just something I could not resist when he said initially, he was like, "Would you want to do like a autopsy of an of a vampire?" And I was like, "That sounds pretty cool. We could do that. I could probably think of something." And then that sort of evolved to, and again, this was just like over a series of months, and it started off as vampires, and then eventually, I don't know what he like. Again, he tells me some of the stuff, crazy stuff that he reads, and I'm just like, that's cool. So he goes down, not really like rabbit holes, but he'll just find whatever he can find that's like an autopsy of a vampire sounds insane, but if he can find, but he literally outdid himself. He's like, no, I found something else. We're going to do this thing that's like, that he looked up, and it was, whether or not it was truly a real thing, somebody had apparently written an article about it, of vampire watermelons. He's like, you want to do an autopsy on a vampire watermelon? And I was like, sold. You got me. You had me at vampire watermelon autopsy. And he essentially, like, all of his stuff he writes, obviously it's his one-man show of everything, but he was like exceedingly generous with, when we were, I guess maybe just we were joking back and forth, and he was like, well, I guess I told him, I was like, I had an idea, do this or maybe this. And he was like, well, just do it. And this is all a long way of saying that when you listen to it, if you think that, that it's not funny what I did, that's all on me. Because I had the idea, I wrote it, I edited it, and there's that piece. And then there's another piece that we added at the very end as well. So we thought it was hysterical. And of the people that have listened to it, they thought it was pretty funny too. They could have just been nice to me, but everyone seemed to have really got a kick out of it. And I still think it's really funny. But if you listen to it and you don't think it's funny, you can at me at that one, because it was all completely me being the most pretentious, ridiculous version of myself and my show ultimately. So yeah, shout out again to Darwin. That was fun. Maybe more collaborations with other folks in the future. Who knows? But that was fun to do. And so that was the one thing. I said I had two. Oh, yeah. So there's actually, all other things being equal, at the end of this month, I've actually got another thing. It's completely unrelated to the podcast. It's just I'm actually trying to get a fair amount of content written and recorded before the end of the month, just so I can keep things consistent, because the next month or so, I'll, again, follow me on Twitter. I'll usually, if the updates I give are just, I don't want to say too much now because it's still a bit early, and that's why I say all other things being equal. At the end of this month, there's something I'm going to be doing that's, again, it's not related to the show. It's just something I've personally been wanting to do for a long time. And I'll probably keep updates on it on Twitter. So again, twitter.com/autopsy_podcast for that kind of stuff. And I won't go into too much more about that because there's a few pieces of it that are still kind of up in the air, but it seems like it might work out. So fingers crossed. All right, let's try and get into this episode proper. And I'm going to start out by, this is going to be kind of a minor shout out, but it was actually a question I got from another podcast friend I've made, because the podcast family out there, if you don't know, they're good people, as we Southerners say. But I got this question, and I'm only acknowledging it because it's, I guess it was a thing on TikTok or whatever. So, and I just got this random message from MJ over at Spooky Tales. So shout out to MJ and Christina. They're both co-hosts of their podcast, Spooky Tales, and that's ESPOOKY, Spooky Tales. And I think you can find it basically, like most podcasts, I think you can find it anywhere, iTunes, Spotify, that kind of stuff. And they sort of do like Latin America. I should have checked notes before I did this, or made notes rather, because they might both scream at me because I might get some of this wrong. But I want to say that because I've listened to several episodes, and it's essentially Christina and MJ talking about Latin America lore, like almost like haunted ghost story-esque, but not really, but sometimes. And I think they're all like centric to like female type stuff, like La Llorona, I think they did an episode about, and that kind of stuff. They might be screaming saying, no, we don't do, it's not just that, but I think it's Latin America, like female centric, like lore type stuff, and they discuss it, and it's very funny, and go listen to it, as Spooky Tales. But I got this not random, but I was chatting with MJ, and she mentioned this TikTok that I had to watch, and I only watched it once. And if you guys are on TikTok, God bless you. I cannot get into it. I am an old man. I don't understand it. I don't understand this language you speak. It's not for me. I say that now. I'll probably be on it in a year doing stupid stuff. But but anyway, she sent me this video, and it's basically like the gist of it is a girl is talking about, what she would do to any guy that wronged or cheated on her friend or something like that. And she goes off on this tangent where she talks about she would inject him with insulin that would kill him, and then she would drive him like 50 miles far away from anywhere, blah blah blah, dig a hole 12 feet deep, bury him, cover it with 6 feet of dirt, put a dead animal on that, then finish burying it. And if they ever found it, they'd find the deer first, and they wouldn't think to look that. And even if they did, they think it was an insulin not an insulin overdose, but they would see whatever it was. Like I only saw it once, but it was essentially like they'd never figure it out. They blah, blah, blah. They just think they had undiagnosed diabetes. And it's funny, but it's not true. As far as toxicology goes, now, and this is where I'll you will hear me probably backpedal quite a bit, because toxicology is not one of my strong points. I've dealt with many drug overdose cases, but in terms of like reading toxicology results, that is something I actually have like for Truett's case, like I go over a lot of the toxicology and what it means. And some of that, like I did know, but there was a lot of it that like I had to sort of refer to some doctor friends that I have that I was like, hey, explain this to me again, that sort of stuff. And I would credit them, by the way, but just for the nature of, again, this is another behind the scenes thing. I can do what I do right now because I don't work for a medical examiner's office anymore. And if I did, and I was doing this and they found out, they'd probably, anybody, they would fire me. They would fire anybody that was doing this, just because it's hard. Legal departments are scared to death of this kind of stuff. So, or not scared, but they just like the way legal departments say it. And I'm really going off on a tangent here, but the way legal departments see a lot of this stuff is you are a representation of this office. If you're out there saying X, Y, and Z, you're not technically authorized to say that. Only this office can give its own press releases, or only this office can release information about blah, 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 blah. So if you're out there as someone that is affiliated with our office and you're giving out information, that you could be held liable. Like, again, the legal stuff is really kind of, it didn't used to be like this, and it's only sort of tightened its grip over the years, and it's honestly driving a lot of doctors crazy, truth be told. But thankfully, I don't work for those folks anymore, so I can tell you all of this stuff. But I do have some consultants who, when I'll talk to them about cases, the actual doctors, as much as I'd love to credit them, it's just best if I don't, and I'll just leave it at that. But going back to Miss Insulin Overdose Girl, the short answer is no. If anyone found a body buried under a dead animal, that case is automatically manner of death homicide. Automatically. They don't have to even do the autopsy if you find a body like that buried 12 feet deep, that is a homicide. And it's a homicide. And that's kind of that. Whether or not they ever find the actual cause of death, depending on decomposition, blah, 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 it will always be a homicide. It will always be an open case. There will never be anyone that's like, oh, he just had diabetes. No, it does not work like that. And again, I'm going to sort of segue that back to toxicology. But the whole thing actually, when I watched the video, there's one part of it that I'm just going to like, it reminded me of a Norm Macdonald joke where if I give credit to anything in the video, it's that the girl had the idea to dig a 12-foot hole. If you have time to dig a 12-foot hole, you are doing very, very well. And it reminded me of a Norm Macdonald joke because he has this whole bit about all these people go to all this trouble, like serial killers or just regular murderers. They do all this stuff and then they just kill people and leave them in a shallow grave. And you're like, that was a lot of work for, you could have tried a little harder at the end. So he has this whole joke about, the hole would have been the first thing I did. And I would have started this like weeks in advance. Just dig the deepest hole you possibly can. And that should be like your biggest concern. So I will say, while most of what this girl went over was total nonsense and she clearly doesn't understand that kind of, and ultimately it's a bit like it's a funny TikTok thing, but it was just presented to me as like, hey, is this a real thing? And I was like, not really, but I will say if someone's taking the time to dig a 12-foot hole, they mean business. And if I'm not going to give out advice on how to kill people, but I'll defer to the Norm Macdonald joke. Digging the hole should be the first thing on your mind. But having said that, toxicology is kind of the big thing we're going to go over this week. Truett's case was the recent episode. His was a tox case. And drug overdoses are, let's see, how do I put this? This actually came out and I'm only bringing it up because some of you may have heard the term. It's not a new term. It's been out for a few years now, at least 3 years or so, about the opioid epidemic in the United States. It started under the previous presidency's administration. Like they started funding money for that kind of stuff. And I think it's still ongoing. I'm not sure. But if you've ever heard the term opioid crisis or epidemic or whatever you want to call it, it is literally referring to cases like Truett's. And again, Truett is doing his case. I wouldn't say he's super well known, but he is one of the more popular people who have recently passed away due to drug overdoses, specifically with fentanyl. But opioids can be fentanyl, morphine. I'm sure there's a whole list. But if you ever hear that, like it truly, like opioid crisis, epidemic, it is a real thing. Like more than any homicide, suicide, anything, like drug overdoses in the U.S. are insane right now and have been for quite a few years. As long as I was a death investigator, the majority of cases we would do most every day were drug overdoses. And illegal drugs kind of come and go. That's sort of the thing about fentanyl right now is fentanyl is technically a legal drug, but it's illegally manufactured in sort of a same way that, morphine is a legal drug, but heroin is kind of derived from, and I think, again, I might get yelled at for this, but heroin is kind of derived from the same plant, which is why anyone that's on heroin, when they overdose, they can test positive for heroin, but in their, I want to say if they actually have a lot of urine that can be ran for toxicology, that urine can be ran and it'll test positive for morphine because you take heroin and when your body metabolizes it, it metabolizes into morphine. So in your urine, when they're checking all this, and I think it's specifically urine because, urine is ultimately waste. So everything's sort of metabolized at that point. Yeah, that makes sense. So if they check your urine and you seem to have a whole lot of morphine in your system, they're not going to think, oh, he's got his hands on morphine. They're probably going to think, oh, he's clearly this is heroin. But by that logic, you probably have heroin in your blood anyway. But heroin, morphine sort of derive from the same stuff. But my point is, morphine is the legal drug. Heroin is the illegal drug. And fentanyl is both, because it's not, again, I went over in Truett's case, it's synthetic. It's not derived from anything natural. So it's got its legal versions, but it's also got plenty of illegal versions. And there's some stuff that can differentiate it. I talk about the 4-ANPP or 4-ANPP. That is something that usually tells the doctor that the fentanyl that they're using is probably not legal. And the broader point to all of this is, when you say drug overdose cases, when people hear that, they tend to think drug overdose cases, their mind usually goes to something like an illegal drug, like heroin, cocaine, maybe fentanyl. People really need to get the idea of fentanyl in their head more, because it's become that big and it is that dangerous. But most people would say, heroin, cocaine, crack cocaine, whatever. When they think of drug overdoses, they go to the illegal stuff. But there certainly are those, and they sort of come in waves. Like heroin was big and then it went away and then it came back a few years later. I'm not sure what the big illegal drug right now is, honestly. But prescription meds, your oxycodone, your hydrocodone, your fentanyl, all of that stuff. More people overdose on prescription drugs than any other drug. And it's not even close. Like, it truly is not even close. So going back again, when we say opioid crisis, specifically, like, it's not talking about, there might be some minor tie to illegal opioids, but it is specifically talking about trying to get into control the legal prescription drugs that people are overdosing on every single day. I don't know what the plan for it is, what they're going to do with all the information that they gather, but it is absolutely a real thing. Just FYI, if you've heard the term and you didn't truly understand what it meant, that's what it means. Like, they are trying to figure out just how big it is. And I think hopefully they're seeing it, because again, every single day, when I was a death investigator, it was insane. Like, you would have no idea that this many people were overdosing on drugs. And going back to Truett, again, most people just don't think of fentanyl when they think of drug abusers these days, even though it is the popular drug right now, or at least one of the biggest. I would be curious if his family even knew that fentanyl was his drug of choice. Like, most people, so many people frown on like marijuana, but marijuana is so much the least of, and I went over this in Truett's case. Marijuana is not a big deal unless it's synthetic marijuana, and it'll absolutely kill you, and you'll probably go nuts while you're dying. So stay away from synthetic marijuana. Stay away from most all drugs, but if you're not, at least be aware how powerful they are. That's another thing about fentanyl. People do not understand how powerful that drug is. Like, it is insanely powerful. And especially when it's manufactured on the street, there's no way to tell just how powerful it truly can be. Like, people they don't know. So I'll get off my Apple box. I won't preach to you guys too much about that stuff. I like to just present the information. That's kind of what Autopsy is. It's kind of what these discussions are. And that's why I don't like to drone on too long about a lot of this stuff, because you don't want to hear me do that. But that will lead into sort of a thing about drug overdoses cases, and this will sort of be one of the final kind of ideas I touch on for this episode, is if you have a loved one who overdoses and passes away, God forbid, but if they do, you may have to wait a little while, longer than you might normally think, to get the death certificate. Usually, someone dies, a coroner issues a death certificate, and that's usually used for, those are necessary for for will readings and all that, and all their stuff, however it gets passed down, there needs to be a death certificate generated, and there needs to be a cause and manner of death on that death certificate. But if you have a overdose case, that can hold you up. Currently, I honestly don't know. But once upon a time, you were looking at least, and it could be more, but they would always give this like you're looking at 90 days, 3 months for the toxicology to come back. And that And it could be more than that, some 3, 4, 5, 6 months. And it's all case backlogs. Just there, again, there's so many overdose cases. It is such an epidemic that it is, the cases are backed up. So many come through, and these toxic, there's only so many resources. There's only so many people working. These people are getting backed up, and it's putting all this off. And again, if you've known anyone and it's taken a while for like the toxicology results, if that's holding up the death certificates, that's why. I'm sure probably in the bigger cities, it's worse. In the smaller, I say bigger cities, but even the smaller cities sometimes contract out their toxicology to bigger areas that'll get backed up as well. So it's hard to know, but there is, usually they give the turnaround time of 3 months. Sometimes every now and then it'll be sooner. It depends what they're checking for, but just something just to keep in mind. Like, it can take a while for a full drug screen toxicology to come back. And that kind of causes that can cause drama between, I guess you could say causes some drama between coroners and medical examiners and families. Families, they want this stuff sort of taken care of, and you're sympathetic to that, but there's just, at a certain point, your hands are tied. There's not a whole lot you can do. Coroners can issue pending death certificates, and that's supposed to help alleviate, get the ball rolling on a lot of people's final will and all that kind of stuff. But I want to say sometimes even those don't necessarily work how they're supposed to, but that's what they're for. But yeah, like, families will get mad, and then they'll sort of that gets relayed to the coroner or the ME, and there's not a whole lot that anyone can do other than some of this stuff just takes time. Now, there is also a little bit of behind the scenes stuff, and this isn't super relevant, but it's something I'll bring up just because I was talking to another old coworker of mine the other day, and this was something, it would happen every so often, but a lot of times coroners would call in cases, and this was for a medical examiner's office that was providing service to coroners in different counties in the state. So coroners would call in these cases, and it was ultimately, you can always tell when a coroner's sort of not being truthful with you. They're sort of dancing around issues, but they'll just say, well, we think it's a possible overdose case. And you're like, oh, okay, did they have a history? And they're like, well, no, but we think the pill count's a little bit off. And then you go through it and you're like, well, that pill count might be off by 1 or 2, but that's not going to overdose. But then the coroner gets very irate. Well, I think it just needs to be checked and blah, 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 blah. And ultimately, most offices, more and more, they're just like, okay, if you're going to argue about this, if you're going to go there with all of this, fine, we'll take a look. So they'll get a lot of cases that aren't necessarily drug overdoses, but they're brought in, and the family has to wind up waiting for the turnaround to get the tox results back. So they're waiting 3 months, and then suddenly the coroner's angry at the ME's office that he just basically conned into getting an autopsy to get the tox. And they do, and by the way, some coroners, I'm not trying to throw shade at a lot of people, but the reason that they do this sometimes is some coroners just are not super confident in just signing out, a natural cause and manner of death, which they can do without an autopsy. And they basically just want doctors to lay eyes on it and tell them that it's ultimately a natural case. But if you can't just say that over the phone, because if the coroner says, I think this is a natural case, it's not going to get a medical examiner autopsy. It doesn't qualify. But if he says, I think it's a drug overdose, or he uses the other magical words, which I think we've talked about previously, but I won't get into here, foul play, he knows the office will relent, even though if there's no evidence to suggest an overdose or any foul play, all they have to do is say the words, and most offices kind of cave to that these days. But then that sort of bites them on the butt in the end, because they'll be held for toxicology for 3 months, and suddenly the family's mad at the coroner and he badgering them, and then the coroner's badgering the ME's office for something that shouldn't have been an ME case. And it's just so there's a little behind the scenes drama of what can go on at these ME offices that the public doesn't know about, doesn't need to know about. It's just one of those things. It doesn't happen that often, but most coroners are, well, I don't know about most coroners, but coroners know their job, and there's very few of them that are like that level of just gung-ho about what they want done and that sort of thing. And again, I won't dwell on it too much more, but yeah, just that there's drama at some of these offices, and it gets a little tiresome, especially when, ultimately it's kind of the families who are having to wait. So it's ultimately them that's kind of having to pay the price for this kind of stuff. But yeah, if you're all that to say, sum all this up, like, yeah, there's a opioid crisis right now. It's backing up everybody's toxicology's backlogs to get the turnaround times. 90 days is supposed to be the standard, but it can just often be a lot more of that. It also depends on, ultimately, the doctor does have a say in what they want checked. Most of them do. If it's a possible overdose case, they'll just say run a full drug panel on it. But if it's something where they think maybe they just alcohol, they just drank too much, that's actually I think that's a little bit quicker of a test, because you don't have to do a full panel on that. The doctor can literally just say, just check for ethanol. And I think those results come back a little bit quicker. But if you want a full drug panel, yeah, you're going to have to wait. And that's why, unfortunately. And that's mostly it. I think, yeah, I'll just kind of leave everything. If you have if you ever have questions about this kind of stuff, or if there's something that I went over, because I'm going off notes here, and I'm just praying that I sort of that everything got addressed appropriately. But if there's something that you need clarification on, again, always autopsypodcast@gmail.com. You can reach out to us, or you can follow us on social media, autopsy_podcast. That's our Twitter account. And then Autopsy Podcast, or at Autopsy Podcast for Instagram and for Facebook. Patreon.com, we've sort of revamped. There's the $3 level now, if you get that. The recent discussion about the Watts and the Lamb doc is there. And also I'm going to throw up the Darwin's Deviations collaboration, now that he's you can go listen to it. But I'm going to go and throw it up on Patreon as well. Just not his episode. I'll just put up, ultimately my part of it. So it's like a 5-6 minute piece, and then like another 2-minute piece that we added at the end. So if you want to hear any of that, you can go to Patreon, sign up. It'll be there for you. And it helps keep the show going. So any and every little bit helps. And we appreciate it. We've got a couple of patrons right now, actually. And yeah, thank you. Or if you like the show and you want to support in another way, you can go to we do have a merch shop. So our logo, we've got a couple of variants of it. It's all Teespring stuff, and all their stuff's usually like really good quality. I've gotten quite a few things from them from other podcasts over the years. It's good stuff. So yeah, you can support us that way as well. And just a quick shout out to Spooky, but just for like these next few podcasts I'm going to recommend, just because ever since I've started getting into more social media and being more active on that, there's been a few accounts that I've interacted with, and they've just been the nicest people. So I'm not asking them to plug me. I'm just these guys are nice, and they all have shows, and I've listened to them all, and I just go listen to them because they're super nice. They're good people. And the first one will be Crime of Your Life. The other one, and that I think Jacob, yeah. Crime of Your Life is Jacob. And then the Jury Room podcast is Kevin. And then also next on Stage 1. So Crime of Your Life and Jury Room, those are clearly more true crime oriented. But if you're looking for something a little bit different, and I tend to do, like, again, I've mentioned this before, like I'll listen. I don't listen to that much true crime. I tend to listen just to, once I do all this and like write the episodes and then do the discussions and talk about all this stuff, and like I just kind of want to listen to anything else. So one of the new ones I've been listening to is Next on Stage 1 with Pixie and Mr. J. I like listening to their banter. So shout out to those guys. And again, and I'm shouting out these guys because they've been exceedingly kind to me on social media. So they're good people. Check out their stuff. Darwin's Deviations, I've said plenty about that now. If you just want complete insanity, go check out his stuff. And then finally, one who's kind of almost since the beginning, like we've sort of had brief exchanges, is the Loser podcast. And his is very, if you like video games and kind of the lore of video games, his is the one to check out. That's specifically what he does. He kind of goes through kind of basically the stories of, well, yeah, the lore of video games. And he's the nicest dude. So yeah. So Jury Room, Crime of Your Life, next on stage 1, Darwin's Deviations, The Spooky Tales, and Loser Podcast. Those are just people that have been exceptionally kind to me. And there's a few more, but those are the people that have that for months and months now have been just very kind. There's other people that have recently reached out and they've been kind. I'll get to you guys eventually, but I just wanted to take a minute for those guys, and just say thanks. And I think I'll leave everything right here. Thank you guys for listening, and thanks for all your support. Thanks for sharing. Thanks for reaching out. Thanks, guys. It means a lot to me, and I hope you're enjoying all this stuff, because it means a lot to me to be able to talk about it, because this is something, again, you may or may not infer, but like, I'm not a death investigator anymore, but I still have a love for a lot of this stuff. And one of the reasons I started doing the show is because I saw so many issues with how things were handled back then that I just wish people would talk about a little bit more, or just be a little bit more open, a little bit more transparent about it. It would save so much frustration, I think, from the public, who just typically, if you don't tell them, they're not going to know. It's nobody's fault. It's just, there just needed to be a bigger conversation that people could hear. And hopefully, I don't know who all else is doing stuff like this. Again, I know Nicole and Jimmy, she's got her whole thing going. There's a few doctors who do it, but I don't know. I just saw a need for connecting people on a level like this. So again, if you're listening and you like it, thank you so much. Simply listening means the world. And I think I'll leave it right there. Take care of yourselves and each other.